I stood outside my son's apartment with a cashier's check for $990,000 in my pocket. I was there to hand him the keys to his dream home and end his financial struggles forever. But as I raised my fist to knock on the sliding glass door, I heard his wife's voice mingling with the deep, unfamiliar laugh of a stranger. I froze in the shadows and listened. The words that came out of her mouth paralyzed me. I didn't knock. I didn't shout. I simply lowered my hand, turned around, and decided in that exact moment to systematically dismantle her entire future. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to protect your family from a parasite disguised as a loved one. I sat in my faded corduroy recliner staring at the crisp bank paper in my calloused hands. $990,000. Paid in full. It was the exact amount required to close escrow on a 4-bedroom suburban house I was buying for my son Connor. The ink was barely dry when my cell phone vibrated on the side table. It was Connor. I answered and immediately heard the exhaustion in his voice. He sounded like a man drowning in quicksand calling to ask if I could possibly lend him $500. He stammered through an apology, explaining that Vanessa needed her premium organic groceries and her specialized Pilates membership renewed, and his paycheck from the logistics firm had barely covered the rent. He told me he was picking up a night shift at a warehouse just to keep their heads above water. I kept my voice steady, playing the role I had played for the last 5 years. I told him it would be tight, that I would have to dip into my emergency retirement funds, but that I would transfer the money. Connor thanked me profusely, his voice thick with guilt, and hung up. He thought I was just a retired construction foreman scraping by on a fixed pension. He had no idea that the calluses on my hands came from 40 years of building a commercial contracting empire that I had quietly sold for 8 figures. I drove the same 10-year-old truck and wore the same flannel shirts because I wanted my son to learn the value of $1 to build his own character without the crutch of inherited wealth. But hearing the sheer desperation in his voice made me realize the lesson had gone far enough. It was time to end his struggle. I put the cashier's check into a manila envelope along with the house deeds and grabbed my keys. The drive to their apartment complex took 20 minutes. It was a deteriorating building on the loud side of town, the kind of place where the hallway lights always flickered. I walked down the concrete path toward their ground floor unit. My plan was simple. I was going to wait for Connor to get home from his warehouse shift, slide the envelope across the kitchen table, and watch the weight of the world lift off my son's shoulders. As I approached the small patio, I noticed the sliding glass door was cracked open to let in the evening breeze. I raised my hand to knock on the glass, but a sound stopped me dead in my tracks. It was a man's laugh, deep, resonant, and entirely unfamiliar. Connor was across town hauling boxes on a loading dock. He wasn't supposed to be home for another 4 hours. I took a step off the concrete path, pressing my back against the brick wall in the shadows beside the window. I held my breath. Through the narrow opening, the clinking of wine glasses echoed into the humid night air. "You need to relax," Vanessa's voice drifted through the screen, smooth and arrogant. "Connor will be at the warehouse until midnight. He thinks he is providing for his family." She let out a sharp, mocking laugh that made the blood freeze in my veins. I heard Trevor shift on the couch. "I am relaxed," he replied, his tone slick and entitled. "I am just tired of sneaking around this dump. How much longer are you going to play house with the guy? He smells like diesel and cheap coffee. Just be patient," Vanessa said. The clinking of a bottle against a glass told me she was pouring another drink. "I am not bleeding him dry just for fun. We are playing the long game. His old man is 65 and looks like he is one bad flu away from a heart attack. Connor is his only kid. The second the old man kicks off, Connor gets that massive house in the suburbs and whatever pitiful savings account the old guy has stashed away." My grip on the manila envelope tightened until my knuckles turned white. "And if the old man holds on for another decade," Trevor asked, sounding irritated, "then we force his hand." Vanessa replied coldly. I am already planting the seeds. I keep telling Connor his dad is getting forgetful, leaving the stove on, losing his keys. In a few months, I will convince Connor that his dad needs to be in a state-run facility. We sell the property, take the equity to cover the care costs, and skim the rest. Once the money is in our joint account, I file for divorce, take half of everything, and you and I leave. I stood in the darkness, the evening air suffocating my lungs. This woman who smiled at me every Thanksgiving, who called me dad, was actively plotting my forced institutionalization and the total financial ruin of my only son. Trevor chuckled a low, greedy sound. You are ruthless, V. What about the kid, though? You are going to drag a newborn into this mess. Vanessa's response was casual, completely devoid of human empathy. She took a sip of her wine. Honestly, I am not even sure if the baby is yours or Connor's. And it does not matter. Connor is so desperate for a perfect family, he will never question it. He will gladly pay child support for the next 18 years either way. It is the ultimate insurance policy. The silence that followed her statement roared in my ears. The cashier's check for nearly $1 million suddenly felt like a brick in my pocket. I looked down at the envelope in my hand. I had driven here to give this woman the keys to an estate, a secure future, and a life of comfort. Instead, I had stumbled upon a parasite feeding on my son's exhaustive labor. I did not bang on the glass. I did not storm into the apartment and demand answers. An emotional outburst would accomplish nothing. Vanessa would simply cry, spin a web of lies, and Connor, blinded by his desperate love for her and the unborn child, might actually believe her. If I confronted them now, I would simply be the crazy old man she was already painting me to be. I slowly lowered my hand from the glass frame. I stepped backward, letting the shadows swallow me as I retreated to my truck. I did not start the engine immediately. I sat behind the wheel, staring at the glowing dashboard clock. The anger burning inside me was not chaotic. It was cold, focused, and precise. I had spent my entire life constructing buildings from the ground up, ensuring every load-bearing wall was perfect. Now I was going to use those exact same skills to methodically demolish Vanessa's life brick by lying brick. The engine of my truck roared as I tore out of the apartment complex parking lot. The tires gripped the asphalt, pulling me away from the balcony, where Vanessa was laughing with a man who was not my son. The envelope sitting on my passenger seat felt like a lead weight. $990,000, a fortune earned through 40 years of breathing drywall dust and pouring concrete, meant to buy my son his freedom. Instead, it was about to fund his absolute ruin. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles ached. The anger in my chest was not a fire. It was a glacier. Cold, slow, and capable of crushing anything in its path. I parked outside First National and walked straight through the double glass doors. I did not greet the tellers. I bypassed the standard line and walked directly into the branch manager's office. He stood up, startled by my sudden entry, but I tossed the manila envelope onto his polished mahogany desk before he could speak a single word of protest. Voided, I said. Every cent. The manager looked at the cashier's check, his face going pale. He opened his mouth to ask questions, but he saw the absolute zero in my eyes and immediately sat down. He began typing rapidly on his keyboard. I stood there silent and unmoving, watching the monitor. The funds reverted to my primary holding account within 3 minutes. The paper that was supposed to secure my son's future was now completely worthless. I walked back out to my truck and locked the doors. I pulled out my phone and dialed a number I had not called since the day I sold my commercial construction firm. Winston Pierce answered on the second ring. Winston was not a friendly man. He was a corporate shark, a lawyer who tore apart hostile takeover attempts with surgical precision and buried liabilities so deep no auditor could ever dig them up. Doug Winston said, his voice a low gravel. You only call me when you need something demolished. I need a blind trust established immediately, I told him, skipping any pleasantries. Irrevocable. I want $990,000 transferred into it before the banking day closes. I want it shielded so heavily that a federal judge could not crack it open with a sledgehammer. Winston did not ask why. He only asked for the beneficiary. Put it in my name, I said. But bury the ownership. If anyone searches my assets, if anyone runs a background check on my estate, I want them to find dust. I want to look like a man living solely on a meager monthly pension. Consider it poured in concrete, Winston replied smoothly. The transfer will be complete in 20 minutes. I will send you the encrypted confirmation. I hung up. The money was safe. Vanessa would never touch a single dime of my legacy. She would never use my decades of labor to fund her escape with another man. But the moment the screen went dark, my phone vibrated in my palm. Connor's name flashed across the digital display. My chest tightened. Just an hour ago, I was ready to give this boy the world. Now I knew his wife was actively plotting to strip him to the bone, and I could not tell him a thing. If I told him the truth now, he would confront her immediately. She would twist the narrative play, the victim cry tears of outrage, and alienate him from me entirely. Connor was desperate for a family. He would believe her lies over my accusations without hard proof. I had to let him see her true face on his own. I took a deep breath, forcing my heart rate to slow, and answered the call. Dad, Connor said, his voice breathless and frantic over the loud mechanical screech of warehouse machinery in the background. Hey, did you get a chance to wire that 500? Vanessa is at the specialty market right now, and her card was declined. She is freaking out at the checkout lane. I stared out the windshield at the passing traffic. I thought about the stranger lounging in his apartment. I thought about the child Vanessa was carrying, a child she casually admitted to her lover might not even belong to my son. I thought about her vile laughter. I am sorry, Connor, I said, making my voice perfectly flat and completely devoid of emotion. I cannot send the money. The line went dead silent for a long moment. The background noise of the warehouse seemed to amplify as my son struggled to process my words. What do you mean you cannot send it? Connor asked, the raw panic rising in his throat. You said you were going to transfer it. Vanessa has a cart full of groceries. She needs her supplements, Dad. She is pregnant. She is already stressed out enough as it is. My jaw clenched so hard my teeth ground together at the word pregnant. The urge to scream the absolute truth at him was nearly overpowering. I swallowed the rage down, burying it deep in my gut. My funds are tied up, I said coldly. I had an unexpected expense this afternoon. I cannot help you. Dad. Please, Connor begged, his voice breaking with genuine humiliation. It is only $500. I am working a double shift tonight hauling crates. I will pay you back on Friday the minute my paycheck clears. Just transfer the money so she can leave the store. She is going to be so angry with me. That is exactly what I was counting on. Vanessa needed to feel the sudden absence of my financial safety net. She needed to panic. She needed to realize that the well was running dry so she would accelerate her desperate plans. I am sorry, Connor, I repeated, maintaining the icy facade. You are a grown man. You will have to figure it out yourself. I hung up the phone before he could beg again. My hand shook violently as I tossed the device onto the passenger seat. Denying my own son food money while he broke his back in a warehouse was the hardest thing I had ever done in my 65 years on this earth. It felt like I was betraying my own flesh and blood. But I knew the reality of the situation. Vanessa was a parasite, and a parasite only stays attached as long as there is a steady flow of blood to drain. By cutting off the cash, I was starving her out. She would show her true colors soon enough. The anger over a declined credit card would push her to make mistakes. But I could not rely on mistakes alone. I needed concrete proof. I needed undeniable, documented evidence of her infidelity and her conspiracy to steal my estate, evidence so overwhelming that Connor could not possibly look away or forgive her. I put the truck in gear and pulled out into the heavy city traffic. My first phone call had protected my money. My next phone call was going to buy me the truth. I needed to find a man who specialized in digging up filth. I did not sleep that night. I sat in the dark of my living room watching the shadows shift across the walls until the sun finally began to rise. At exactly 7 in the morning, I picked up my phone and made a call to a man named Miles. Miles was a former forensic accountant turned private investigator. During my years running the construction firm, he was the man I hired when I needed to find the dirt a shady subcontractor had buried beneath a concrete slab. He was discreet, ruthless, and brutally efficient. I never thought I would need to deploy him against my own family, but the rules of engagement had changed the moment I stood outside that sliding glass door. I met Miles at a quiet diner on the outskirts of the city. I slid a blank envelope across the table. Inside was a piece of paper with 2 names, Vanessa Barrett and a man named Trevor. I told Miles about the apartment address, the timeline of Connor's work shifts, and the conversation I had intercepted. I told him to dig into everything. I wanted bank records, credit histories, phone logs, and geolocation tracking. I needed to know exactly who this Trevor was, and I needed to know exactly where my daughter-in-law was spending my son's money. Miles did not offer useless sympathy or ask unnecessary questions. He simply pocketed the envelope, finished his black coffee, and told me he would have a preliminary dossier in 48 hours. Those 48 hours tested every ounce of discipline I possessed. Connor called me on the second day. He sounded completely hollowed out, his voice thin and raspy from lack of sleep. He told me he was taking on a 3rd job doing weekend inventory at a warehouse across the state line. He explained that Vanessa was experiencing severe pregnancy anxiety and needed a premium meal delivery service to manage her stress levels. I sat in my armchair, gripping the armrests so hard, the wood groaned, listening to my boy exhaust himself for a parasitic lie. I forced my voice to remain completely steady, playing the role of the helpless retiree. I told him to stay strong and hung up, staring blankly at the floor. Exactly 48 hours after our meeting at the diner, Miles knocked on my front door. He walked straight into my study and dropped a thick gray folder onto my mahogany desk. The heavy thud of the paper echoed in the quiet room. Miles sat down across from me, his expression grim. He told me it was much worse than a simple affair. Trevor was not just a random stranger. He was a bottom-feeding nightclub promoter with a suspended driver license and a severe gambling addiction. But Trevor was the least of my son's problems. I opened the folder. The very first page was a comprehensive credit report. It belonged to Connor. I stared at the numbers, feeling the air completely leave my lungs. I had raised Connor to be meticulous with his finances. I taught him from a young age to never spend money he did not physically have in his hands. But staring back at me was a list of 5 active credit cards, all completely maxed out to their absolute limits. The total revolving debt was just over $40,000. I looked up at Miles in disbelief, stating that Connor did not even own a single credit card. Miles tapped the paper with his index finger. Connor did not open those accounts, he explained. Vanessa did. She used his social security number, forged his electronic signature, and routed all the digital banking statements to a secondary email address she controlled exclusively. Connor had absolutely no idea these accounts existed. He was legally responsible for $40,000 of high-interest debt he had never seen. I flipped to the next section of the dossier. It was a transaction ledger for the fraudulent cards. There were thousands of dollars spent at high-end boutiques, luxury day spas, and expensive downtown restaurants. But my eyes locked onto a massive recurring charge. It was a monthly auto debit for $1,200. I asked Miles what the charge was for. He reached to the back of the folder, pulled out a glossy photograph, and slid it across the desk. It was a picture of a sleek, black luxury sports car parked outside an upscale apartment building. Miles explained that the vehicle belonged to Trevor. Vanessa had used one of Connor's fraudulent credit cards to put down a $10,000 down payment on the lease, and she was using another forged card to pay Trevor's monthly car note. My son was literally breaking his back on night shifts at a warehouse to pay for the luxury vehicle his wife's lover was driving around town. A cold, absolute fury settled deep in my chest. Vanessa was not just cheating on my son, she was financially crucifying him. She was bleeding him dry, with a smile on her face. If Connor discovered this kind of betrayal on his own, the sheer magnitude of the debt and the deception would completely shatter him. The $40,000 was a heavy noose she had quietly slipped around his neck, and she was simply waiting for the right moment to kick the chair out from under him. I closed the gray folder and rested my hands flat on top of it. The evidence was irrefutable. It was documented illegal financial fraud. I could easily take the dossier to the police station right then and there and have Vanessa arrested for identity theft. But if I did that, Connor would be left standing in the wreckage of his marriage, completely devastated and confused. Vanessa would cry, blame her actions on pregnancy hormones, and claim she did it out of panic. Connor was too desperate for a family. He might actually forgive her. I needed to extract the parasite carefully. I needed Vanessa to tighten her own noose. I realized that since I had cut off her access to my $500 handouts, she was going to feel the sudden financial pressure. A parasite deprived of its host will immediately scramble to find a new blood supply. I paid Miles his fee in cash and locked the dossier inside my heavy iron safe. The trap was set. All I had to do was wait for Vanessa to realize she was running out of money. I knew she would not wait long to pivot her attention directly toward my estate, and when she did, I would be ready to let her destroy herself. The doorbell echoed through the quiet halls of my home just after 6 in the evening. I did not get up immediately from my armchair. I let the chime ring a second time deliberately, letting the silence stretch, calculating the exact amount of desperation standing on my front porch. When I finally opened the door, Vanessa stood under the amber glow of the porch light, holding a glass casserole dish wrapped in aluminum foil. She wore a perfectly tailored beige trench coat and carried a designer leather handbag, the exact kind of premium accessories bought with $40,000 of stolen credit. Her smile was a practiced, immaculate mask of familial devotion, but her eyes were darting, scanning the interior of my home with the hungry urgency of a buzzard circling a dying animal. "I brought you dinner," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Connor told me you had some unexpected expenses today, and I just could not bear the thought of you eating canned soup. We worry about you so much when you are all alone in this big house." I stepped aside and let her in, wrapping myself in the invisible cloak of a frail, strapped retiree. The scent of the lasagna preceded her, a heavy processed garlic smell that immediately gave away it was store-bought, and simply transferred into a glass dish to fake the effort of a home-cooked meal. Everything about Vanessa was a cheap imitation transferred into a premium container. I thanked her, my voice quiet and slightly raspy, as I followed the sharp, rhythmic click of her high heels down the hallway and into my kitchen. She set the dish on the granite island, her gaze lingering on the polished stone countertops and the custom oak cabinetry I had installed myself 20 years ago. I watched her mind working, running the appraisals, calculating the equity locked inside the walls of my property. She did not come here to feed me. She came here to audit me. The sudden denial of the $500 loan had cut off her financial oxygen supply, and she needed to know exactly how much blood was left in the stone. Connor was practically in tears this afternoon. Vanessa sighed, leaning against the counter and crossing her arms. "He feels terrible for asking you for money. We know how hard it must be for you scraping by on your pension every month. It breaks his heart to see you struggle, especially knowing how expensive property taxes are getting in this neighborhood." I walked over to the sink to fill a glass of water, keeping my back to her. The manipulation was so blatant, so perfectly engineered to pry open my financial vault. She was digging for confirmation that I was broke, testing the structural integrity of my bank accounts. During my 4 decades running commercial construction sites, I had dealt with corrupt union bosses, extortionist suppliers, and ruthless city inspectors. I knew exactly how to spot a shakedown. "I manage just fine, Vanessa," I said, turning around and taking a slow sip of water. "The house has been paid off for years. I just have to be careful with my liquid cash. Emergencies happen. You know how it is." I saw the micro-expression of relief wash over her face at the confirmation that the house carried no mortgage. Her eyes briefly shifted to the ceiling, a silent prayer of gratitude to the god of greed. She took a step closer, lowering her voice into a register of deep, manufactured sympathy. "We just want you to be safe," she murmured, reaching out to gently touch my forearm. A cold revulsion crawled up my skin at her touch, but I forced my muscles to remain completely relaxed. Living in a house this size all by yourself, it just seems so overwhelming. Have you ever thought about downsizing, finding a nice, manageable little apartment? Connor and I could help you sell this place. You could put the cash in a high-yield account and never have to worry about a $500 grocery bill ever again. It was a staggering display of arrogance. She was standing in my kitchen eating food bought with my son's stolen credit, casually suggesting I liquidate the home I built so she could siphon the equity directly into her own pockets. I looked at her face, studying the feigned concern, and realized that a direct confrontation would be entirely useless. If I threw her out and accused her of theft, she would play the victim. She would run to Connor, weeping about how his cruel, paranoid father had attacked her out of nowhere. I needed her to expose herself. I needed her to leap blindly into a trap of her own making. I looked down at the floor, letting a long, heavy silence fill the kitchen. I let my shoulders slump, releasing a deep, ragged sigh. I reached up and rubbed my temples, squeezing my eyes shut, as if fighting off a sudden, disorienting fog. "Downsizing," I muttered, my voice suddenly trembling, losing its cadence. "Maybe. I do not know anymore. It is just so much paperwork. The property taxes, the utility bills. It all just blends together lately." I sat my glass of water down on the counter, intentionally missing the coaster. Vanessa leaned in closer, her predatory instincts flaring. "What do you mean it blends together? Are you feeling all right, Doug?" I blinked rapidly, staring past her at the blank wall, widening my eyes to simulate a sudden wave of severe cognitive confusion. I patted the pockets of my flannel shirt frantically, then began opening random kitchen drawers, moving with a clumsy, panicked urgency. "Where is my wallet?" I stammered, my voice climbing an octave in manufactured distress. "I had my wallet. I need to pay the foreman. The concrete delivery is late and the foreman needs his cash." Vanessa froze. "Doug," she said, slowly stepping back. "You retired 5 years ago. There is no concrete delivery." I ignored her, pulling my thick leather wallet out of my back pocket. I held it up, staring at it as if it were a foreign object. Right. The concrete." I whispered, staring vacantly through the kitchen window into the dark backyard. I walked deliberately toward the stainless steel refrigerator. I opened the heavy door, placed my leather wallet squarely on the middle shelf directly next to a carton of milk, and closed the door. I turned back to Vanessa, offering her a blank, serene smile. "Martha should be home soon," I said, using the name of my late wife who had passed away over a decade ago. "She went to the pharmacy. Did she tell you what time she was coming back?" The absolute stillness in the kitchen was deafening. Vanessa stood paralyzed, her eyes locked on the closed refrigerator door, where my wallet now rested. I could practically hear the gears grinding in her head as she processed what she had just witnessed. A normal, compassionate human being would have been terrified. A loving daughter-in-law would have rushed to my side, called my son, and immediately dialed a doctor. But Vanessa was not human. She was a parasite, and I watched the sheer, unadulterated joy slowly illuminate her face. She realized she did not have to wait for a heart attack. She did not have to wait for old age to take me. She was looking at a man she believed was rapidly descending into severe dementia. "Martha will be home very soon, Doug." Vanessa whispered, her voice slick with a sinister, triumphant calm. "Do not worry about a thing. You just go sit down in your chair and rest. I will take care of everything from here." She did not ask me if I was feeling dizzy. She did not pull my wallet out of the refrigerator. She simply backed away toward the front hallway, her eyes shining with the manic thrill of a predator that had just found the keys to the slaughterhouse. "I will call Connor and tell him you love the dinner," she called out from the foyer. "You just get some sleep." The heavy oak door clicked shut. I stood in the center of the kitchen, surrounded by the absolute silence of my empty house. I did not move for 30 seconds, ensuring she had actually walked down the driveway and gotten into her car. Then I rolled my shoulders back instantly, shedding the posture of the frail, broken senior citizen. I walked to the refrigerator, opened the door, and retrieved my wallet, sliding it smoothly back into my pocket. I walked into my study and sat down at my desk, opening my laptop. The blue light of the screen illuminated the dark room. Less than a minute later, my cell phone vibrated on the desk. It was a secure, encrypted ping from Miles. My private investigator had successfully cloned the cloud backup servers attached to Vanessa's phone network the previous night. Every message she sent, every digital footprint she left was being automatically routed directly to my screen. I opened the intercepted dispatch. It was an SMS text message sent from Vanessa's phone to Trevor's number, time-stamped exactly 40 seconds after she walked out of my front door. The text read, "The old man is completely losing it. He just put his wallet in the fridge and asked for his dead wife. We do not have to wait for him to die. We can get power of attorney right now. Start looking at real estate listings in the tropics. We are about to cash out." I stared at the glowing letters on the screen. The absolute sheer malice of her words radiated through the digital text. She was actively celebrating the decay of my mind. She was already spending my life's work in her head, preparing to legally strip my son of his inheritance while he broke his back in a warehouse to buy her organic groceries. A grim, humorless smile touched the corners of my mouth. She had taken the bait with spectacular greed. She believed she was a mastermind, pulling the strings of a tragedy, moving her pieces across the board to secure an effortless fortune. She had no idea she had just walked directly into a steel trap, and I was about to lock the jaws completely shut. The trap was set, and Vanessa wasted absolutely no time walking right into it. 2 days after her visit to my kitchen, the gaslighting campaign began with ruthless, calculated efficiency. I was sitting on my front porch, nursing a cup of black coffee, when Connor pulled up in his battered sedan. He looked significantly worse than before. The dark circles under his eyes resembled deep bruises, and his shoulders were hunched under an invisible, crushing weight. He did not wave or say hello when he walked up the steps. He just held out a thick stack of red stamped envelopes. He asked me what was going on. His voice trembled with a mixture of profound exhaustion and genuine fear. He showed me final notice utility bills, a severe property tax warning, and a threatening medical collection letter. He told me Vanessa had found them crammed inside my mailbox, mixed in with the weekly junk mail. She had called him while he was on his shift at the warehouse, crying hysterically, telling him she was terrified I was rapidly losing my grip on reality and that my finances were in complete disarray. I stared down at the envelopes in his shaking hands. I recognized the return addresses, but I knew for an absolute fact that every single one of my accounts was set to autopay from my secure, impenetrable pension fund. I never received paper bills. Vanessa had gone through the exhaustive trouble of digging up old discarded statements from my recycling bin, scanning them, altering the dates and the amounts on her computer, and printing them in high definition just to stuff them in my mailbox. It was a meticulous forgery designed to break my son's faith in my sanity. I looked at my son. I saw the absolute terror in his eyes. He was looking at me not as his father, but as a crumbling liability, a tragic burden he was now responsible for carrying. I swallowed the burning bile rising in my throat and played my part perfectly. I let my hands shake. I reached out and took the forged letters, squinting at them, as if the numbers were written in an incomprehensible foreign language. I mumbled that I must have forgotten to mail the checks, that the days were just slipping away from me lately, blending into one long, confusing blur. Connor covered his face with his calloused hands and let out a broken, agonizing sob. He told me it was okay, that he and Vanessa were going to figure it all out and take over my finances so I would not have to stress anymore. I nodded vacantly, playing the helpless, deteriorating victim while my blood ran like ice water through my veins. He hugged me tightly, his grip desperate and sad, before he left to go work his second job. The second his car disappeared down the street, I dropped the pathetic act. My posture straightened. The trembling in my hands vanished. I walked back into my house and locked the heavy oak door. I knew Vanessa was escalating her timeline. She was establishing a documented, irrefutable history of my incompetence. But she had absolutely no idea who she was dealing with. My entire career in commercial construction was built on site security risk management and exposing corrupt contractors. Within 3 hours of Connor leaving, I had a private security firm operating inside my house. They were professionals, men who asked zero questions, and worked with absolute silent discretion. They wired my entire property with microscopic high-definition cameras. They hid lenses inside the smoke detectors behind the crown molding and seamlessly integrated them into the air vents. Every single room, every hallway, and every conceivable angle of my study was covered by a live feed that beamed directly to an encrypted off-site server routed through my laptop. The invasion happened exactly 48 hours later. I told Connor over the phone that I was taking a city bus across town to visit a hardware store and would be gone all afternoon. Instead, I parked my truck 3 blocks away in a commercial lot and walked back through the alleyway, slipping into my own basement through the reinforced cellar door. I sat in the complete darkness, the glow of my laptop screen illuminating the damp concrete walls. I watched the live camera feeds of my empty house waiting for the parasite to strike. At exactly 2 in the afternoon, the front door lock clicked open. Vanessa stepped into my foyer. She moved with a casual, terrifying confidence. She was not sneaking or tiptoeing like a common thief. She walked through my home with the arrogant stride of someone who already owned the property. On the screen, I watched her walk directly to the mahogany table in the hallway. She picked up my spare set of car keys, the ones I used specifically for the truck. She looked at them for a second, a vicious smirk playing on her lips, and then walked into the kitchen. She tossed the keys straight into the trash can, burying them deep under a pile of wet coffee grounds and discarded food wrappers. Later that evening, she would undoubtedly help Connor search the house for them, sighing in theatrical pity when they finally found them in the garbage, cementing the illusion of my rapidly decaying mind. But hiding keys was just amateur child's play. I watched her move back down the hallway and enter my private study. The camera hidden in the smoke detector directly above my desk captured her every movement in crystal clear 4,000 pixel resolution. She sat in my leather chair and pulled a thick stack of documents from her designer handbag. I zoomed in on the feed, watching her manicured hands sort through the papers. They were fake past due notices from a collection agency, intricately designed to look official. She opened my desk drawer, placed the forged notices right on top of my legitimate tax documents, and closed it. She was actively building a massive paper trail of dementia, a legal barricade she would eventually use to force me into an institution. I sat in the cold basement, my hands resting on the keyboard. The evidence was stacking up perfectly. The private investigator already had her financial fraud documented. The hidden cameras now had her trespassing, tampering, and planting false evidence. It was almost enough to end her right then and there. But then she did something that crossed the definitive line from financial exploitation into attempted murder. Vanessa stood up from my desk and walked out of the study. I switched the camera feed to the master bathroom. She walked in and opened the medicine cabinet above the sink. My heart stopped beating in my chest. She reached up and grabbed the orange prescription bottle that held my daily blood pressure medication. I watched her unscrew the white plastic cap. She poured the small life-saving pills into the palm of her hand and callously dumped them straight down the bathroom sink, running the faucet to wash them down the drain. The casual, thoughtless nature of the act was staggering. Then she reached into the pocket of her coat. She pulled out a small plastic bag filled with generic over-the-counter aspirin. They were the exact same size and the exact same powdery white color as my prescribed medication. She carefully poured the aspirin into my prescription bottle, screwed the cap back on, and placed it exactly where she had found it on the shelf. The air in the basement felt suddenly incredibly thin. I could not breathe. I was watching a woman deliberately sabotage a vital heart medication, replacing it with a dangerous blood thinner. If I had actually been suffering from severe dementia, if I had blindly taken those pills without noticing the missing manufacturer imprint on the chalky surface, my blood pressure would have spiked dangerously out of control. Combined with the massive psychological stress she was manufacturing, with the fake bills, I could have easily suffered a massive fatal stroke. It was no longer just a scheme to steal my money and take control of my estate. It was a calculated, cold-blooded execution. She did not want to wait for the stress to break my mind so she could file for power of attorney. She was actively trying to kill me, leaving absolutely no trace behind but a bottle of what looked exactly like the correct medication. I watched her check her reflection in the bathroom mirror on the live feed. She fluffed her hair, checked her makeup, and smiled. It was a genuine, relaxed smile, the expression of a woman who felt completely untouchable. Then she walked out of the house, locking the door behind her and leaving me to a fate she had engineered. I sat in the absolute silence of the basement for a long time. The laptop fan whirred softly in the dark, the only sound in the suffocating quiet. The recording was saved, backed up to 3 separate secure servers guarded by Winston Pierce. The trap was no longer just a financial snare designed to expose a cheater. It was a reinforced steel cage, and she had just locked herself inside it. She thought she was playing a brilliant, effortless game of chess against a weak, dying old man. But she had no idea that I had stopped playing chess days ago. I was building a guillotine, and she had just gladly laid her own neck upon the block. The heavy thud of footsteps on my porch dragged me away from the glow of my surveillance monitors in the basement. I quickly shut the laptop and shoved it into the bottom drawer of my desk. Through the front window, I saw Connor walking up the steps. He was dragging his feet. His uniform was stained with sweat and industrial grease. He looked like a man carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. He knocked twice before pushing the door open. I slouched deep into my armchair. I let my jaw go slack and stared blankly at the television screen playing a muted daytime program. Connor walked into the living room and collapsed onto the sofa. The springs groaned under his weight. He smelled of diesel exhaust and stale warehouse coffee. His hands were covered in fresh blisters from moving heavy wooden crates all night. I looked at my boy. He was 30 years old, but right now he looked like an exhausted child. I wanted to stand up and wrap my arms around him. I wanted to tell him that his massive mortgage was already paid in full. I wanted to tell him that he never had to work another night shift in his life. But I had to swallow that instinct. I had to let him bleed a little longer to cure the infection entirely. "Dad!" He said, his voice cracking immediately. I turned to him slowly. I blinked several times, simulating a deep mental fog. "Connor," I asked, making my voice sound weak and reedy, "are you just getting off work?" He leaned forward and buried his face in his calloused hands. His shoulders heaved. He was crying. The sound of his quiet sobs tore through my chest like a serrated blade. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a stack of glossy pamphlets. He laid them gently on the coffee table. The covers featured smiling elderly people walking through manicured gardens. They were brochures for state-run assisted living facilities. "Dad, we need to talk," he whispered, wiping his eyes with the back of his dirty sleeve. "Vanessa and I have been talking all night. I am so sorry. I am so incredibly sorry." I stared at the pamphlets. My blood boiled, but I forced my hands to tremble. "What are these?" I asked, pointing a shaking finger at the glossy paper. Connor took a deep breath. His eyes were completely bloodshot. He looked at me with a mixture of profound pity and desperate exhaustion. "Dad, you left the stove on again yesterday," he said, repeating the lie his wife had fed him. "You put your wallet in the refrigerator. We found those past due notices in the mail. You are forgetting things, important things. The house is too big for you now. We are terrified that you are going to get hurt when nobody is around to watch you." Every word out of his mouth was a testament to Vanessa and her brilliant, poisonous manipulation. She had isolated him. She had exhausted him. And now she had convinced him that the father who built a commercial empire from dirt was rapidly decaying into a helpless burden. "I do not need to go to a home," I stammered, letting my voice hitch with manufactured panic. "I am fine here, Connor. I just get a little tired sometimes. That is all." Connor slid off the sofa and knelt on the floor right in front of my chair. He grabbed my hands. His grip was desperate. "Dad, please," he begged, his tears falling freely onto my knuckles. "I am working 80 hours a week. Vanessa is stressed out with the baby coming. She is terrified that the bank is going to take your house because you keep forgetting to pay the property taxes. We cannot afford to hire a full-time nurse. We barely have enough money for groceries." He was completely broken. Vanessa had systematically dismantled his confidence and replaced it with a crushing sense of inadequacy. He truly believed he was failing his pregnant wife and failing his dying father. "Vanessa wants to help," he continued, his voice dropping to a pleading whisper. "She volunteered to take over everything. She said she will manage your estate. She will handle all the bills and coordinate the sale of the house. We can use the equity to get you into a premium care facility. You will have doctors and nurses around the clock. You will not have to worry about a single thing anymore. We will handle the heavy lifting." The absolute sheer audacity of the plan was staggering. Vanessa was sending my son to kneel at my feet and beg me to hand over the keys to my own slaughter. She had weaponized his love for me. She knew Connor would never forcibly evict me. She knew he had to believe it was the only way to save my life. I looked into his bloodshot eyes. I saw the ghost of the little boy who used to sit in my lap and watch me draw architectural blueprints. He trusted me implicitly then, and now he was placing all of that trust into the hands of a predator. The agony of keeping my secret was almost unbearable. I could tell him everything. I could march him down to the basement and show him the high-definition footage of his wife pouring my heart medication down the drain. I could show him the $40,000 in fraudulent credit card debt she had strapped to his name. I could play the audio of her laughing about the baby belonging to a washed-up nightclub promoter. But I knew my son. I knew his desperate need for a cohesive family. If I showed him the truth right now in the midst of his total physical and emotional exhaustion, his mind would reject it. He would panic. He would call Vanessa demanding an explanation. She would spin a masterclass of lies. She would claim I faked the footage because I hated her. She would say the credit cards were for emergency baby supplies. She would cry and threaten to take his unborn child away forever. And Connor, paralyzed by the fear of losing his family, might choose to believe her. He might choose the comfortable lie over the devastating truth. I could not risk it. The execution had to be public. It had to be undeniable. It had to be a masterstroke where Vanessa had absolutely zero room to maneuver. I had to let him bleed for just a few more days. I pulled my hands away from his grip. I let genuine tears well up in my eyes. I did not have to fake the sadness. The grief I felt for my son was entirely real. "You think I am losing my mind?" I asked, my voice cracking with perfect agonizing fragility. "You think your old dad cannot take care of himself anymore?" Connor squeezed his eyes shut. A fresh wave of tears tracked through the warehouse dust on his cheeks. "No, Dad," he sobbed. "I think you are tired. I think you need rest. Please just let Vanessa manage the burden. She is so good at this kind of stuff. She just wants to protect our family. Let her take the reins. Please." I stared at the wall for a long, silent minute. I let the clock tick in the background, amplifying the heavy, agonizing weight of his request. I slumped my shoulders forward completely, surrendering my posture. I let out a long, defeated sigh. "Okay," I whispered. Connor opened his eyes. He looked at me as if I had just granted him a pardon from death row. "If you really think it is what is best for the family," I said, avoiding his gaze. "If Vanessa is willing to take on the responsibility." "I do not want to be a burden to you, Connor. I never wanted to be a burden." "You are not a burden, Dad," he cried, wrapping his arms around my waist and burying his face in my chest. "You are my dad. I just want you to be safe. I love you so much." I stroked his hair. My hand rested on his tired, shaking shoulders. "I love you too, son," I said softly. "And I am going to make sure everything is taken care of. I promise you that." He pulled away and wiped his face with a dirty handkerchief. He looked incredibly relieved. The invisible weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He told me Vanessa already had the power of attorney paperwork drafted by a paralegal friend. He said she was ready to move quickly before the bank could intervene on the fake overdue notices. "We need to do it soon, Dad," he said, his voice finally stabilizing, "before things get more complicated. Can we meet this Friday to sign the transfer papers?" I nodded slowly. "Friday," I repeated. "Yes. Friday sounds perfect. We should have a family meeting. Just you, me, and Vanessa. We can sign everything over." Connor smiled a weak, exhausted smile. "Thank you, Dad. Vanessa is going to be so relieved. She is going to handle everything. You will not have to worry about another bill ever again." He stood up. He told me he loved me one more time before walking out the front door. He headed to his car to drive home and deliver the glorious news to his wife. He was handing her the victory she had so ruthlessly orchestrated. I watched his taillights fade down the street. The second his car rounded the corner, the tears vanished from my eyes. The frail, stooped posture evaporated. I stood up tall in the center of my living room. The cold, calculating energy flooded back into my veins. Vanessa wanted a family meeting to sign over my life. She was going to get exactly that. But she would not be managing my estate. She would be managing the explosive, catastrophic detonation of her own reality. I walked down the hallway to my study and picked up the phone. I dialed Winston Pierce to finalize the venue change for Friday. The trap was now fully baited, and the predator was sprinting directly toward the snare. The basement of my home was entirely silent, except for the low, rhythmic humming of the computer server rack I had installed against the far concrete wall. The single desk lamp cast long shadows across the floor. I sat perfectly still in my leather chair, staring at the high-definition monitor in front of me. The private investigator I had hired was worth every single dollar of his exorbitant fee. He had successfully bypassed the security protocols on Vanessa's phone the previous night. He created a digital mirror that streamed every single keystroke, every text message, and every web search directly to my secure laptop. I was currently watching a live feed of her digital life, and her digital life was rapidly collapsing into absolute chaos. A notification tone chimed softly from my speakers. A text message had just arrived on Vanessa's phone. It was from Trevor. I watched the text bubble populate on the screen. The arrogant, entitled tone the nightclub promoter usually used was completely gone. His words were erratic and frantic. He typed in rapid bursts of fragmented sentences. He was terrified. The bookies he owed money to were no longer accepting his excuses. They did not care about a pregnant girlfriend or an impending inheritance. They had given him an absolute ultimatum. He needed to produce $15,000 in cash by sunset, or they were coming to find him. Trevor threatened Vanessa directly. He typed that if she did not wire him the funds immediately, he was going to drive straight to the warehouse where Connor was currently working his double shift. Trevor promised to introduce himself to my son and explain exactly who was driving the luxury sports car Connor was unwittingly paying for. I leaned closer to the monitor. The tension in the basement was thick enough to choke on. Vanessa was backed into a corner. Her carefully constructed house of cards was about to be completely demolished by a degenerate gambler. She could not let Trevor speak to Connor. If Connor found out about the affair and the stolen credit cards, her entire master plan would instantly evaporate. She needed a massive infusion of cash to keep Trevor quiet. But I had completely severed her access to my money. The bank of Doug was closed. I watched the screen as Vanessa scrambled. She quickly closed the messaging application and opened a mobile banking portal. My jaw clenched so tightly my teeth ached. She was not logging into their joint checking account. That account was empty because I had stopped subsidizing their groceries. She was navigating into a separate financial portal entirely. She typed in a password and pulled up the independent contractor business account belonging to Connor. This was the solitary account where my son hoarded every spare penny he earned from his grueling side jobs. He used it exclusively to save for his quarterly tax payments and to buy replacement tools for his labor contracts. It was his professional safety net. The current balance read exactly $16,200. It represented hundreds of hours of backbreaking labor. Vanessa did not hesitate for a single second. She clicked directly onto the wire transfer tab. She pasted Trevor's routing number into the recipient field. She typed in the amount of $15,000. She was leaving the father of her child with absolutely nothing. She was willing to bankrupt his business just to buy herself a few more days of silence from her lover. The absolute profound cruelty of her action sent a fresh wave of cold fury rushing through my veins. I sat back in my chair and simply watched the cursor hover over the confirm button. I did not panic. I did not pick up my phone to warn Connor. I had anticipated this exact maneuver. 2 days prior, I had sat in the immaculate downtown office of my attorney, Winston Pierce. I had instructed Winston to utilize his vast network of corporate banking contacts to place an invisible blanket of security over every financial entity attached to my son. Winston was a man who moved millions of dollars across international borders before breakfast. Imposing a phantom security hold on a local contractor account was effortless for him. He had placed a hard-stop algorithmic trigger on the ledger. Any outbound wire transfer exceeding $5,000 would automatically freeze the entire account pending a rigorous verbal verification process from the primary account holder. On my monitor, I watched Vanessa confidently click the green confirmation button. She expected the money to vanish from my son's account and land safely in Trevor's hands. She expected her problem to be solved. The website loading wheel spun for exactly 3 seconds. A bright crimson error banner suddenly materialized across her screen. The transaction was suspended. A critical security hold had been activated due to suspicious outbound activity. The portal instructed the user to visit a physical bank branch with 2 forms of government identification to release the frozen funds. Vanessa frantically clicked the refresh button. She tried to initiate a smaller transfer. She tried to move $5,000. The red banner flashed again. She tried to move $1,000. The system locked her out entirely. The screen went gray, and a prompt demanded the primary account holder contact the fraud department immediately. She was completely trapped. Winston's snare had clamped shut with flawless precision. The digital mirror showed Vanessa rapidly opening her web browser. She frantically searched for ways to bypass a security hold. She looked for methods to authorize a wire without the primary account holder. Every search result told her the exact same thing. She was paralyzed. The money was sitting right there behind a digital glass wall, and she could not touch a single cent of it. I watched as she finally abandoned the banking portal and reopened her messaging application. She had to deal with Trevor. She had to keep him away from the warehouse. I read her response as she typed it out in real time. She lied to him. She typed a long, desperate paragraph explaining that the bank had initiated a standard 48-hour security clearing window because the wire amount was so large. She swore to him that the money had already left the account and was just waiting to clear the Federal Reserve protocols. She begged him to stall the men he owed money to for just a few more days. She told him he had to trust her. Trevor's response was immediate and furious. He called her a liar. He told her the bookies were going to break his legs. He demanded to know why he should wait for a single second longer. Vanessa typed her final response. It was the exact message I had been waiting for. It was the absolute confirmation of her supreme, arrogant delusion. She told Trevor to look at the bigger picture. She wrote that $15,000 was absolute pocket change compared to the payout they were about to receive. She promised him the ultimate victory. She explicitly detailed that this coming Friday she and Connor were sitting down for a family meeting with the old man. She boasted that she had fully convinced my son that I was suffering from severe advanced dementia. She typed out her absolute certainty that on Friday afternoon I would be signing over the entire durable power of attorney directly to her. She told Trevor that by Friday evening, she would have unmitigated legal access to every single asset, property, and retirement fund I possessed. She promised him millions. She begged him to hold the line until Friday, because Friday was the day they won the lottery. Trevor did not reply for 10 minutes. The silence stretched out on the digital feed. Finally, a single message populated on the screen. He told her she had exactly until Friday at sunset. If the power of attorney was not signed, and the money was not available by the time the sun went down, he was going to burn her entire life to the ground. I read the exchange 3 times. The documentation was pristine. It was ironclad proof of wire fraud, attempted grand larceny, and a coordinated conspiracy to exploit a vulnerable senior citizen. It was enough evidence to lock Vanessa in a federal penitentiary for the next decade. I closed the laptop and sat in the dark. My breathing was slow and even. The trap had worked perfectly. She had swallowed the bait so deeply it was tearing out her throat. She believed she had outsmarted a dying old man and manipulated a naive husband. She was resting her entire survival on the meeting scheduled for Friday. She was clinging to the illusion that Friday would be her coronation. She had absolutely no idea that Friday was not going to be a transfer of power. Friday was going to be an absolute execution. Friday morning broke with a cold, unforgiving clarity. I stood in the center of the massive living room of the luxury estate, the sunlight pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the pristine, untouched hardwood floors. Just a week ago, I had envisioned this exact space filled with the sounds of a growing family. I had imagined my son carrying boxes through the front door, laughing with relief. I had imagined an unborn grandchild taking their first steps across the polished wood. Every single one of those warm, comforting visions had been systematically slaughtered by the woman currently speeding toward this address. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed Connor. He answered on the first ring, his voice thick with exhaustion and lingering anxiety. I kept my tone weak, dialing up the forced tremor in my throat. I told him I could not handle the emotional weight of signing over my life inside the house I had shared with his mother. I told him Winston Pierce, my attorney, had secured a private, neutral location for us to execute the power of attorney transfer. I read him the address of the estate in the exclusive gated community. Connor sounded confused by the upscale location, but he was too thoroughly beaten down by his warehouse shifts and his wife's relentless gaslighting to question it. He agreed to meet me at noon. Winston arrived 20 minutes before they did. My attorney walked through the sprawling foyer with his usual predatory grace. He did not marvel at the vaulted ceilings or the crystal chandelier. He simply walked into the formal dining room, set his heavy leather briefcase on the massive mahogany table, and took his seat. He knew exactly what was about to happen. He knew the absolute devastation I was about to unleash, and he sat in perfect, chilling silence, ready to facilitate the execution. At precisely noon, the low rumble of Connor's battered sedan echoed up the long, circular driveway. I stood deep in the shadows of the hallway, watching them through the sheer curtains framing the heavy oak front door. The contrast between my son and his wife was agonizing to witness. Connor stepped out of the driver's seat, looking like a hollow shell of a man. His shoulders sagged under the invisible weight of his fabricated financial ruin. Vanessa, however, stepped onto the pristine cobblestone driveway like a conquering queen arriving to claim her throne. The moment she saw the sheer scale of the estate, her entire demeanor physically altered. She stopped dead in her tracks. Her eyes widened, scanning the manicured lawns, the massive stone columns, and the sheer opulence of the property. Even from behind the glass, I could see the unadulterated greed radiating from her face. She practically vibrated with excitement. She grabbed Connor by the arm, whispering something to him, her gestures frantic and thrilled. I knew exactly what was running through her calculating mind. She believed the sudden change of venue was my grand, pathetic final gesture. She assumed I was moving into a state facility today, and that this sprawling million-dollar estate was the hidden asset I was gifting them as an early inheritance to soften the blow. She believed her psychological torture had completely broken my mind, forcing me to surrender my wealth directly into her waiting hands. Connor unlocked the front door and pushed it open. Vanessa walked in right behind him, her designer heels clicking sharply against the imported tile. She let out a soft gasp of fabricated awe as she looked up at the towering foyer ceiling. Dad Connor called out, his voice timid and uncertain. I stepped out from the shadows of the hallway, instantly adopting the slumped, defeated posture of a confused old man. Vanessa did not hesitate. She rushed across the foyer, wrapping her arms around my neck in a suffocating embrace. Her expensive perfume filled my lungs, a cloying, toxic scent that took every ounce of my willpower not to physically shove away. Doug, she whispered, her voice layered with heavy artificial sympathy. This place is absolutely breathtaking. Is this what you meant when you said your funds were tied up last week? You bought this for us, did you not? You wanted to make sure we were taken care of before you transitioned into your new care facility. You are so incredibly generous. She could not even wait 5 minutes to claim ownership. She was already mentally arranging her furniture in the empty rooms. The $15,000 debt she owed her desperate lover, the fraudulent credit cards, the lies she believed they were all about to be permanently erased by the sheer magnitude of this hidden estate. I gently pulled away from her toxic embrace. I kept my eyes fixed on the floor, playing the role of the disoriented victim. I told them we needed to go into the dining room. I muttered that my lawyer was waiting, that my head was spinning, and that I just wanted to get the paperwork over with so I could finally rest. Vanessa practically floated down the hallway. She walked into the dining room and her eyes immediately locked onto Winston Pierce. More specifically, her eyes locked onto the leather briefcase resting on the table in front of him. To her, that briefcase contained the keys to her absolute freedom. She took her seat at the table with aggressive confidence. She smoothed her expensive trench coat, folded her hands, and rested them on the polished mahogany. She looked at Winston with a sharp, victorious smile, completely ready to sign her name and legally strip my son of everything he possessed. Connor took the seat beside her. He looked around the massive, echoing room, entirely overwhelmed by the luxury surrounding him. He looked at me, his eyes filled with profound sorrow, believing he was about to watch his father legally declare himself incompetent. He reached out and placed his calloused hand over Vanessa's folded hands, seeking comfort from the very parasite that was actively draining his life. I took my seat at the head of the table. The trap was now perfectly sealed. The venue was secured. The audience was present. The predator was sitting comfortably in the crosshairs, smiling, as if she had already won the war. She had absolutely no idea that the ink in Winston's pen was not meant for a power of attorney transfer. It was meant to sign her absolute destruction. The dining room was vast and utterly silent. The ceiling stretched high above us, but the air felt impossibly heavy. I sat at the head of the massive mahogany table. Winston Pierce sat to my right. He wore an immaculate charcoal suit, and his expression was carved out of granite. His heavy leather briefcase rested on the polished wood directly in front of him. Across the table sat my son and the woman who was actively trying to destroy him. Vanessa could barely contain her excitement. Her eyes darted from the briefcase to my face and back again. She drummed her manicured fingernails against the table in a rapid, frantic rhythm. She was seconds away from claiming her ultimate prize. Connor sat beside her, looking like a casualty of war. His skin was pale and drawn tight over his cheekbones. The physical toll of working double shifts at the warehouse to support her fabricated debts was etched into every line on his face. He kept his hands folded in his lap, staring down at the table with an expression of profound sorrow. He truly believed he was about to witness the legal end of his father. Vanessa leaned forward and rested her elbows on the table. She offered me a smile that dripped with synthetic warmth. "We are so proud of you, Doug," she said softly. "We know this is a difficult step for you to take, but it is the right thing to do. You deserve to rest. You deserve to be in a place where people can watch over you properly. And you do not need to worry about a single detail. I am going to handle the estate. I will take care of the house, the bills, and all the legal burdens. You just need to sign the power of attorney paperwork today, and we will handle the rest." I looked at her face. I studied the absolute brazen confidence shining in her eyes. She was utterly convinced she was the smartest person in the room. She thought Winston was just a hired pen ready to execute her master plan. Connor looked up at me. His eyes were shining with tears. He told me he loved me. He promised me he would visit the care facility every single weekend. He swore he would never abandon me. His voice was choked with genuine grief. He was a good man who had been completely hollowed out by a parasite. I nodded slowly. I let my shoulders slump forward one last time, playing the role of the broken patriarch. I turned to Winston and told him we were ready to proceed. Vanessa practically vibrated in her chair. She reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a gold-plated pen. She set it on the table and demanded the documents. She told Winston they had a busy afternoon ahead of them and needed to get the transfer finalized immediately. Winston did not say a word. He did not look at her. He simply reached out and unclasped the heavy brass locks on his briefcase. The metallic click echoed sharply in the silent room. He opened the lid. Vanessa leaned forward, her breathing shallow and rapid. She expected a thick stack of legal bindings. She expected deeds and trusts and a durable power of attorney stamped with official state seals. Winston reached into the briefcase and pulled out a single slim manila folder. He did not hand it to Vanessa. He slid it across the polished mahogany table directly toward me. I placed my hand flat on top of the folder. I kept my head down for 3 long seconds. The silence stretched until it became a physical pressure in the room. And then I dropped the act. I straightened my spine. I pulled my shoulders back. The manufactured tremor in my hands completely vanished. The cloudy, vacant look in my eyes dissolved instantly, replaced by a cold, unyielding clarity. I looked directly across the table into Vanessa's eyes. The smile on her face faltered. A tiny flicker of confusion crossed her features. She saw the shift in my posture. She saw the absolute stillness in my gaze. Her predatory instincts flared, but she was too arrogant to understand she had already walked into the trap. I slid the manila folder across the table. I did not push it toward Vanessa. I pushed it directly in front of Connor. "Read it," I commanded. My voice was no longer the weak, reedy whisper of a decaying old man. It was the hard, commanding baritone of a man who had controlled construction sites and broken corrupt contractors for 4 decades. Connor flinched at the tone of my voice. He looked at me in absolute shock. He had not heard me speak with that kind of authority in months. He looked down at the plain manila folder sitting in front of him. Vanessa reached for the folder immediately. She told Connor not to worry about it. She laughed nervously and said I was probably just confused again. She insisted she should review the documents first to make sure everything was in order. Winston Pierce spoke for the first time. His voice was like grinding stone. He told her not to touch the folder. He informed her that the documents were strictly privileged and intended solely for the eyes of Connor. Vanessa froze. Her hand hovered over the table. The first genuine spike of panic finally breached her confident facade. She looked at Winston and then back at me. She asked what was going on. Her voice was climbing an octave, losing its smooth, practiced rhythm. Connor slowly opened the folder. The first document sitting on top of the stack was a printed credit card statement. It bore the logo of a premium platinum account. The name on the account was Connor. He stared at it in complete bewilderment. He told me he did not own a platinum credit card. He said his only credit card had a $2,000 limit, and he kept it in his glove compartment for emergencies. "Look at the balance, Connor," I instructed, my voice utterly devoid of emotion. "Look at the itemized charges." Connor picked up the paper. His eyes scanned the heavy black ink. He read the total outstanding balance aloud, $42,500. The color instantly drained from his face. His skin turned an ashen, sickly gray. He looked at the itemized list. He read off charges for luxury boutiques, high-end day spas, and designer shoe stores. He saw a $5,000 charge for an exclusive resort weekend in a city he had never visited. He looked at his wife. He asked her what this was. He asked her how his name was on an account he had never seen. Vanessa immediately went on the defensive. She slammed her hand on the table. She told Connor it was a mistake. She claimed it must be identity theft. She raised her voice, pointing a finger at me, accusing me of printing fake documents because my dementia was making me paranoid. She said I was trying to ruin their marriage because I was sick and confused. "Turn the page, Connor," I said, slicing through her frantic screaming with absolute calm. Connor set the credit card statement down. His hands were trembling violently. He turned to the next page in the folder. It was a printed transcript. The text was formatted with clear timestamps and phone numbers. It was the exact verbatim exchange of the text messages between Vanessa and Trevor from the previous evening. "Read it aloud," I commanded. Connor stared at the paper. His chest was heaving. He read the first line. It was Trevor demanding $15,000 by sunset. He read Trevor threatening to drive to the warehouse and introduce himself. Connor stopped reading. He looked up at Vanessa. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal was beginning to fracture his mind. He asked her who Trevor was. Vanessa leapt out of her chair. She screamed that this was a horrific violation of her privacy. She shouted that I had illegally hacked her phone and that she was going to call the police. She tried to snatch the transcript out of Connor's hands, but Winston Pierce simply placed his large hand firmly over hers, pinning it to the table. He advised her to remain seated unless she wanted to experience the full weight of the private security contractors waiting in the hallway. Vanessa dropped back into her chair. She began to cry. She covered her face with her hands and sobbed loudly. She told Connor that Trevor was just a terrible man who was trying to extort her. She claimed Trevor had stolen her identity and was threatening to hurt their unborn baby if she did not pay him. She spun a frantic, desperate web of lies, trying to drown the truth in a flood of manufactured tears. "Keep reading, Connor," I said, refusing to let her derail the execution. "Read her responses." Connor wiped his eyes. His tears were no longer tears of exhaustion. They were tears of absolute shattering grief. He read Vanessa's replies. He read how she tried to wire $15,000 out of his secret business account. He read how the transaction was frozen. He looked at her and asked her if she had tried to empty his business account. He told her that money was for his quarterly taxes. He told her if that money disappeared, he would go to prison for tax evasion. Vanessa cried harder. She reached across the table and tried to grab his arm. She begged him to listen to her. She swore she was only trying to pay the extortionist so he would leave their family alone. She swore she was doing it to protect him and the baby. She played the victim with masterful precision, wielding her pregnancy as an impenetrable shield. Then Connor read the final message. He read the paragraph where Vanessa told Trevor to wait until Friday. He read her exact words, boasting about how she had convinced her husband that his father was suffering from severe dementia. He read her triumphant declaration that on Friday she would secure the power of attorney and have unrestricted access to millions of dollars. He read her promise to pay Trevor from his father's liquidated estate. The dining room fell into a horrifying, deathly silence. The only sound was the ragged intake of Connor's breath. He slowly set the paper down on the polished mahogany. He did not look at me. He stared directly at the woman sitting beside him. The woman he had worked 80 hours a week to support. The woman he had defended. The woman he loved. Vanessa saw the look in his eyes, and her entire strategy shifted. The tears instantly vanished. The helpless victim facade evaporated. She realized the paper trail was absolute and undeniable. She realized Connor had seen the absolute truth of her malice. She backed away from the table, her chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. She turned her fury entirely onto me. She pointed a shaking finger at my face and screamed that I was a monster. She shouted that I was a manipulative, psychotic old man who had orchestrated this entire scenario just to destroy her life. She claimed I was obsessed with controlling my son, and that I could not stand the fact that he loved her more than he loved me. She screamed that the documents were completely fabricated by Winston Pierce. She accused my attorney of being a corrupt conspirator paid to forge digital records to frame an innocent pregnant woman. She clutched her stomach and doubled over, letting out a theatrical wail of agony. She screamed that the stress I was putting her through was going to kill her baby. She looked at Connor and demanded he choose. She demanded he stand up, grab her hand, and walk out of this house forever. She told him if he stayed in this room and listened to my insane paranoid delusions, he would never see his child. Connor sat frozen in his chair. He was caught in the absolute center of a catastrophic emotional explosion. He looked at the forged credit card statements. He looked at the transcript where his wife called his father a dying old Mark. He looked at Vanessa screaming and crying and clutching her stomach, demanding his blind loyalty. His mind was struggling to reconcile the loving, supportive wife he thought he knew with the ruthless, calculating parasite exposed in the documents. I sat in perfect silence at the head of the table. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend myself against her hysterical accusations. I let her scream. I let her flail blindly in the snare. Every word she shouted only tightened the noose around her neck. She was demonstrating the exact unhinged, volatile behavior she had spent weeks trying to project onto me. Winston Pierce watched her performance with an expression of mild, clinical disgust. He slowly closed his leather briefcase and folded his hands on the table. He was waiting for my signal. Vanessa stopped screaming. She stood by the door, her chest heaving, waiting for Connor to obey her command. She expected him to break. She expected his profound, desperate need for a family to override the cold, hard facts resting on the table. She held out her hand to him, her eyes blazing with a mixture of terror and dark, commanding authority. I looked at my son. I saw the fracture running deep through his soul. I knew he was standing on the absolute precipice. I knew I had to deliver the final crushing blow to shatter her illusion entirely. I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket and pulled out a small black digital recorder. I set it gently on the table right next to the manila folder. The trap was ready to close permanently. Vanessa stood at the edge of the dining table, her chest heaving as she screamed accusations into the quiet room. She pointed her trembling finger at my face and called me a paranoid lunatic. She told Connor that Winston and I had fabricated the credit card statements and the text messages out of thin air. She played the role of the hysterical pregnant victim, perfectly demanding that Connor take her hand and walk out of this toxic house immediately. Connor sat frozen in his chair, his eyes darting between the fraudulent documents resting on the polished mahogany and his weeping wife. His mind was fracturing under the immense weight of the lies, but he was still desperately trying to hold on to the illusion of his marriage. I did not raise my voice to defend myself. I did not offer a single word of argument against her hysterical shrieking. I simply looked down at the sleek black cell phone resting on the table in front of me. I reached out and pressed a single button on the illuminated screen. The luxury estate had been wired with a state-of-the-art surround sound system, integrated seamlessly into the ceiling of every room. Winston had connected my device to the central hub an hour before they arrived. A soft electronic chime echoed through the dining room, and then the crystal-clear audio of a recorded telephone conversation filled the air. It was Vanessa. Her voice was sharp and arrogant, lacking any of the manufactured sweetness she used when speaking to my son. She was talking to Trevor. The recording was captured just 3 days ago, when the private investigator first tapped her phone. Trevor was complaining about the money he owed to his bookies. Vanessa laughed. The sound of her cruel, mocking laughter echoed off the high ceilings of the dining room. She told Trevor to stop whining because the big payday was almost here. She called Connor a pathetic, predictable workhorse. She boasted about how incredibly easy it was to make him work double shifts at the warehouse by simply pretending to cry over fake utility bills. Connor sat completely paralyzed at the table. He listened to the woman he loved casually describe him as a mindless draft animal born only to pull her weight. Then the audio shifted to a topic that completely destroyed the remaining fragments of Connor's heart. Trevor asked her what she was going to do about the fake pregnancy once she secured my estate. Vanessa sighed loudly on the recording, sounding profoundly annoyed by the question. She told him she was just going to fake a tragic miscarriage as soon as the power of attorney paperwork cleared. She said she would blame the loss of the baby on the extreme stress of dealing with my deteriorating mental health. She promised Trevor that the fabricated tragedy would keep Connor completely under her control while they drained his business accounts and liquidated my properties. She told her lover they would be sipping drinks on a tropical beach within a month, while her husband wept over a child that never existed. The audio cut off abruptly. The absolute silence that followed was suffocating. Vanessa stood completely still. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Her hysterical tears vanished instantly, replaced by the raw, naked terror of a predator caught fast in a steel trap. She looked at Connor. She tried to reach out and touch his shoulder. She stammered that the audio was fake. She claimed I had hired someone to mimic her voice. She insisted it was computer-generated artificial intelligence designed specifically to frame her. She was desperately clinging to the very edge of the cliff, trying to pull my son down into the abyss with her. I did not let her finish her pathetic lie. I picked up a small black remote control resting next to my phone and pressed the main power button. The massive 85-inch flat-screen television mounted on the far wall of the dining room flashed to life. The screen glowed bright white for a fraction of a second before displaying a high-definition video feed. It was the footage from the hidden camera inside my master bathroom. The resolution was flawless. Vanessa stopped talking. She stared at the massive screen in absolute horror. Connor slowly lifted his heavy head and looked at the television. He watched his wife walk into my private bathroom. He watched her open the medicine cabinet. The camera angle provided a perfect, unobstructed view of her face and her hands. He saw her take the orange prescription bottle containing my life-saving blood pressure medication. He watched as she casually unscrewed the cap and poured the pills directly down the sink. He watched her turn on the faucet to wash away the evidence. Connor's breathing became incredibly ragged. He was watching premeditated murder unfold in brilliant high definition. He watched Vanessa pull the plastic bag of cheap over-the-counter aspirin from her expensive coat pocket. He watched her meticulously refill my prescription bottle with the dangerous substitutes. He saw her smile at her own reflection in the mirror before placing the bottle back on the shelf. The absolute casual cruelty of the act was staggering. She was not just stealing money from our family. She was actively trying to induce a fatal heart attack or a massive stroke. She was executing a cold-blooded plan to end my life so she could inherit my wealth without waiting for the natural progression of time. The video feed ended and the screen went completely black. The reflection of the dining room was visible in the dark glass. Vanessa was trapped in the reflection, standing perfectly still, with her hands trembling violently at her sides. There was absolutely no way to deny the video. It was not a forged document. It was not a manipulated audio file. It was a crystal-clear visual record of a severe felony, attempted murder, elder abuse, tampering with prescribed medication. The crimes were stacked so high they practically touched the vaulted ceiling of the room. Connor slowly stood up from his chair. His movements were incredibly stiff, as if his body had suddenly aged 40 years in a matter of seconds. He looked at Vanessa. He did not yell. He did not scream or curse. The profound betrayal had burned away all of his anger, leaving only a cold, desolate wasteland of grief. He looked at the woman he had promised to protect and cherish, the woman he had worked himself to the bone for, the woman who had lied about carrying his child just to extract every last ounce of his financial and emotional worth. Vanessa took a step toward him. She whispered his name. Her voice was incredibly small, broken by the sheer crushing weight of her exposed malice. She asked him to please listen to her. She told him she was just scared and desperate, and that she never meant for things to go this far. Connor did not say a single word to her. He reached down to his left hand. He grasped the plain gold wedding band circling his finger. He pulled it off in one smooth, definitive motion. He held it in his palm for a second, feeling the heavy weight of the lie he had been living for the past 3 years. Then he dropped the ring onto the polished mahogany table. The sharp metallic clatter echoed violently in the silent room. The ring spun in a tight circle before falling flat directly on top of the forged credit card statements. Connor turned his back on her and walked toward the far window, staring blindly out at the manicured lawn. He was entirely done. The poisonous parasite had been completely severed from the host. Vanessa looked at the gold ring resting on the table. She realized her absolute control over my son had been entirely shattered. She had lost her primary shield and her only source of income. She turned her panicked gaze to me and then to Winston Pierce. She saw the cold, unyielding justice waiting in our eyes. She realized that the documents and recordings on the table were not just proof designed to open Connor's eyes. They were a meticulously assembled prosecution packet, ready to be handed directly to the district attorney. The crushing reality of a federal prison sentence finally crashed down upon her shoulders. She spun around and lunged for the hallway. Her designer heels slipped slightly on the polished hardwood floor as she frantically scrambled toward the grand foyer. She reached the massive double front doors and grabbed the heavy brass handle. She pulled it with all of her strength. The door did not move an inch. She grabbed the deadbolt and tried to twist it, but the mechanism was completely locked in place. She pounded her fists against the heavy oak wood, letting out a breathless, terrified scream. She was a rat trapped inside an impenetrable steel cage. Winston Pierce slowly stood up from his chair at the dining table. He buttoned his charcoal suit jacket with calm, practiced precision. He looked down the hallway at the panicked woman clawing helplessly at the front doors. He spoke in a voice that carried the heavy absolute weight of the law. He informed Vanessa that the estate was equipped with an integrated smart security system. He told her he had remotely engaged the perimeter deadbolts the exact moment she walked into the dining room. Vanessa turned around, pressing her back against the locked door. Her chest heaved with terror. She demanded that Winston open the door immediately. She threatened to sue him for unlawful imprisonment and kidnapping. Winston simply adjusted his glasses and offered her a grim, humorless smile. He advised her to save her legal threats for her assigned public defender. He checked his gold wristwatch and announced that the private security contractors waiting outside had successfully flagged down the local authorities. He stated clearly that he had dispatched the full digital dossier of her financial fraud and the unedited video of her tampering with a prescribed medication to the police chief exactly 10 minutes ago. The faint wailing sound of approaching sirens drifted through the thick glass of the front windows. The sound grew steadily louder, cutting through the serene quiet of the exclusive neighborhood. Vanessa slowly slid down the solid oak door, collapsing into a heap on the imported tile floor. She pulled her knees to her chest and buried her face in her hands. There were no more lies left to spin. There were no more victims left to manipulate. The trap had executed flawlessly, snapping its steel jaws shut and leaving her with absolutely nothing but the terrifying reality of her own devastating consequences. The wail of the sirens grew from a distant hum into an ear-splitting scream. The sound tore through the serene quiet of the luxury neighborhood and bounced off the high-vaulted ceilings of the estate. Red and blue lights violently pierced the sheer curtains of the grand foyer. The alternating colors washed over Vanessa, where she sat collapsed against the heavy oak front door. Her chest heaved with frantic, ragged breaths. She looked like a trapped animal. The arrogant, calculating woman who had confidently strutted into the house just an hour ago was completely gone. In her place was a broken, terrified shell, realizing that the absolute end of her freedom had arrived. Connor remained in the dining room, standing by the massive windows. He did not move a single muscle. He watched the reflection of the flashing lights against the polished mahogany table. He looked at the gold wedding band resting next to the forged credit card statements. He was mourning the death of a life he thought he had. I walked slowly from the dining room into the grand foyer. Winston Pierce followed silently behind me. My heavy boots clicked against the imported tile. I stopped 10 feet away from Vanessa. She scrambled to her feet, pressing her back flat against the locked wood. Her eyes darted wildly toward the narrow glass side panels framing the entrance. She was looking for a way out. But instead of an escape route, she saw something that made the remaining blood drain completely from her face. I watched her eyes widen in absolute horror. Through the glass, she saw a sleek black sports car idling at the very edge of the long, circular driveway. It was Trevor. The sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long, dark shadows across the manicured lawn. He had kept his promise. He had driven directly to the estate at sunset to collect his $15,000. Vanessa pressed her face against the cold glass. I could hear her frantic whispering. She was silently begging Trevor to drive away. But Trevor was completely oblivious to the trap. He was trapped in his own desperate reality, frantically checking his phone for the wire transfer that would never arrive. He did not even notice the first two police cruisers until they aggressively swerved off the main road and violently boxed his sports car in. The heavy police interceptors blocked his front bumper and his rear bumper simultaneously. There was absolutely no room for him to maneuver. Vanessa let out a choked, agonizing gasp. She watched as 4 armed officers sprang from their vehicles. They drew their weapons and shouted commands that were muffled by the thick, reinforced glass of the foyer. Trevor raised his hands in the air, surrendering instantly. The officers dragged him out of the driver's seat, shoved him against the hood of his expensive car, and violently secured his wrists in heavy steel handcuffs. Vanessa turned away from the window. Her entire body was shaking uncontrollably. She looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated terror. She asked me what I had done. Her voice was nothing more than a hollow, pathetic rasp. I looked at her with the absolute cold detachment of an exterminator examining a captured pest. I told her I did not just expose her pathetic little affair. I told her I tied up every single loose end she carelessly left behind. I explained that my private investigator had tracked the location of Trevor using the digital mirror we installed on her phone. I told her we ran a comprehensive background check on her degenerate lover while she was busy forging my medical documents. I explained that Trevor had 2 massive outstanding felony warrants for illegal gambling operations and wire fraud spanning 3 different counties. I told her I forwarded his exact location, his criminal dossier, and the precise time he planned to arrive at this address to the local authorities over an hour ago. The realization crashed down upon her shoulders with the weight of a collapsing building. She realized the police had not just responded to a random emergency call. They had arrived with a meticulously prepared prosecution packet handed to them on a silver platter. I told her that Trevor was currently being arrested for his outstanding felony warrants and that the police already had digital copies of their text messages discussing extortion and elder abuse. I told her that Trevor would undoubtedly turn state evidence against her the second he was seated in an interrogation room. I explained that a coward who gambles away his life savings would never hesitate to trade his pregnant girlfriend for a reduced prison sentence. Vanessa clamped her hands over her ears, trying to block out the devastating reality of my words. She slowly slid back down the door, weeping, with a profound, inescapable despair. She had tried to play a game of ruthless survival, but she had brought a plastic knife to a tactical war. Winston Pierce stepped forward. He pulled a small digital key fob from the pocket of his immaculate charcoal suit. He pressed a single button. The heavy electronic deadbolts securing the grand double doors clicked loudly as they disengaged. The sound was like a gunshot in the tense silence of the foyer. Winston calmly reached out and pulled the massive oak doors open. 3 uniformed police officers immediately stepped into the house. They moved with swift tactical precision. Their radios crackled with static. The lead officer stepped directly toward Vanessa. She did not try to run. She did not try to fight. She simply sat on the tile floor crying hysterically and begging for mercy. The officer instructed her to stand up. When her legs refused to support her weight, 2 officers grabbed her strictly by the arms and hoisted her to her feet. The lead officer looked her directly in the eyes and began to recite the charges. His voice was loud and entirely devoid of emotion. He told her she was being placed under arrest for felony elder endangerment. He told her she was being charged with criminal wire fraud and the forgery of financial documents. And finally, he told her she was facing a premier charge of attempted murder for the deliberate tampering and destruction of prescribed cardiovascular medication. The words echoed off the high ceilings, confirming the absolute end of her life as she knew it. The officers forced her arms behind her back, and the sharp, metallic ratcheting sound of the handcuffs locking into place filled the room. Vanessa twisted her neck wildly, looking past the officers and into the dining room. She saw Connor standing in the doorway. He was watching the entire scene with hollow, dead eyes. She screamed his name. She begged him to do something. She cried that she was carrying his child and that he could not let them take the mother of his baby away. She utilized her absolute final desperate weapon, hoping his fundamental decency would override his shattered heart. She pleaded with him to call a lawyer to pay her bail to save their family. Connor did not move a single muscle to help her. He looked at the woman who had systematically manipulated him, exhausted him, and tried to murder his father for financial gain. He looked at the handcuffs binding her wrists. He spoke for the very first time since reading the transcripts. His voice was incredibly quiet, but it carried a weight that completely silenced her screaming. He told her she was no longer his family. He told her that if the child she carried was actually his, he would fight for full, absolute custody the second it was born. He promised her she would never see him or the baby outside the thick, reinforced glass of a prison visitation room. He turned his back on her and walked away, disappearing deep into the shadows of the silent house. Vanessa let out a long, agonizing wail. It was the sound of total, unmitigated defeat. She went entirely limp, forcing the police officers to physically drag her out the front door and down the cobblestone steps. I walked out onto the grand porch and stood beside one of the massive stone columns. The cool evening air washed over my face. I watched the officers shove her aggressively into the back of a waiting cruiser. I looked across the lawn and saw Trevor already locked inside the adjacent vehicle, his head bowed in complete surrender. The officers slammed the heavy metal doors shut simultaneously, sealing their fates. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the pristine landscaping one last time before the cruisers shifted into gear. They rolled slowly down the circular driveway, merging onto the main road, and disappearing into the descending twilight. The wail of the sirens faded into a distant, insignificant hum before vanishing entirely. The street returned to its perfect, serene silence. I stood on the porch for a long time, taking a slow, deep breath of the clean air. The poisonous parasite had been completely and surgically excised from our lives. I turned around and walked back into the bright, echoing foyer of the luxury estate. Winston Pierce was standing quietly by the door, his leather briefcase secured firmly in his hand. He offered me a single respectful nod, confirming the absolute success of our operation. The war was over. The truth had prevailed, and my son was finally safe. The heavy oak front doors clicked shut, and the absolute silence of the luxury estate rushed in to fill the massive empty space left behind. I walked slowly from the grand foyer back into the formal dining room. The room felt entirely different now. The frantic, poisonous energy that Vanessa had dragged into the house was gone, completely excised by the flashing red and blue police lights that were now miles away, speeding down the highway. Connor was still sitting at the massive mahogany table. He had not moved a single inch since he dropped his gold wedding band onto the polished wood. I looked at my son. His broad shoulders were hunched forward, and his head hung heavy over his chest. He looked like a man who had just survived a devastating shipwreck, only to find himself stranded alone on a desolate rock in the middle of a raging ocean. I did not rush to speak. I did not want to fill the quiet room with empty platitudes or useless words of comfort that would only cheapen the magnitude of what he had just witnessed. I simply pulled out the heavy wooden chair next to him and sat down. The sunlight was completely gone now, replaced by the cool, deep blue shadow of the early evening. The ambient darkness in the dining room stretched long across the pristine hardwood floors. We sat in that absolute stillness for a very long time. I listened to the steady rhythm of his breathing. It was slow and shallow, representing the breathing of a man completely depleted of all his physical and emotional reserves. He had spent the last 3 years running on a brutal treadmill of fabricated panic and manufactured debts. He had worked double shifts loading heavy wooden pallets and sacrificed his own physical health to provide for a woman who viewed him merely as a beast of burden meant to pull her weight. The physical toll of that relentless, unyielding labor was etched deeply into the premature lines on his face and the raw calluses covering his hands. But the emotional toll was far worse and much more insidious. The absolute betrayal had shattered the very foundation of his reality. He had believed he was building a family with a partner who loved him. He had believed he was about to become a father and raise a child in a safe environment. Discovering that the pregnancy was a calculated, fabricated lie designed specifically to manipulate his grief and keep him docile was a psychological wound so deep it would take years to properly heal. Connor slowly lifted his head and looked at the empty chair across the table where his wife had been sitting just an hour ago. He looked at the forged credit card statements and the damning transcripts resting near his discarded wedding ring. He asked me how I knew. His voice was a hollow, raspy whisper barely loud enough to reach my ears. He asked me how long I had known that the woman he loved was a predator. I looked at the beautiful grain of the mahogany table. I told him I had suspected something was wrong for a very long time. I explained that a man does not spend 40 years navigating the treacherous, cutthroat waters of commercial construction without learning how to accurately spot a con artist from a mile away. I told him Vanessa always looked at my property and my bank accounts with the hungry, desperate eyes of a starving scavenger waiting for a wounded animal to die. But suspicions were never enough to destroy a marriage. I told him I needed absolute, undeniable proof because I knew how deeply he loved her. I explained that I had to let her believe she was winning so she would become arrogant and careless. I told him the hardest thing I had ever done in my entire life was sitting in my armchair and watching him cry over forged utility bills, knowing I could not tell him the truth until the trap was perfectly set. Connor closed his eyes and let out a long, ragged breath. He told me he felt like an absolute fool. He said he should have seen the signs. He recalled how Vanessa would always isolate him from his friends, and how she constantly complained about his modest income despite the fact that he was working himself to the bone. He whispered that he had ignored every single red flag because he was so desperate to build the perfect life they had always talked about. He said he felt entirely empty, completely drained of any purpose or direction. He told me he had absolutely no money left in his business accounts, and that his credit score was completely destroyed by the massive fraudulent cards she had opened in his name behind his back. He stated that he was 30 years old, and he had absolutely nothing to show for his life but a massive pile of debt and a shattered marriage. I placed my hand firmly on his shoulder. I told him he was not a fool for believing in the woman he married. I told him that trusting your partner is exactly what a good man is supposed to do. The fact that she weaponized his fundamental decency did not make him weak. It just made her a monster. I told him that starting over at 30 was not a death sentence. It was a clean slate. I told him the toxic, malicious infection had been permanently removed from his life, and now he could finally breathe clean air without looking over his shoulder. He shook his head slowly. He pointed a trembling finger at the massive windows looking out over the sprawling, manicured lawns of the luxury estate. He asked me why we were sitting inside this massive house. He asked if I had really bought this place to live out my final years in a care facility. He said he did not understand why I would purchase $1 million home just to sign it away. I reached into the inner pocket of my coat. I bypassed the small digital recorder I had used to play the audio files and pulled out a thick, heavy envelope sealed with a red wax stamp. I set it gently on the table directly in front of him. I slid it across the polished wood until it touched his folded hands. I told him I never had any intention of moving into a care facility. I explained that my mind was sharper than it had been in decades, and my health was perfectly fine. I told him I had spent my entire life building an empire from the dirt up so that my family would never have to struggle the way I did when I was a young man. I reminded him of the countless nights I spent away from home working on commercial job sites pouring concrete and negotiating brutal contracts just so he could have a better life. I told him everything I did was always for him. I instructed him to open the envelope. Connor looked at the thick parcel with tired, hesitant eyes. He slowly broke the red wax seal and pulled out a dense stack of official legal documents. The heavy watermarked paper was bound with a thick silver clip. He stared at the first page. The bold black letters at the top indicated it was a finalized escrow transfer and a certificate of title. I asked him to read the name of the primary beneficiary. He read the name aloud. It was his name. He frowned and rubbed his eyes, assuming the dim light in the dining room was playing tricks on his vision. He looked at the property address listed on the deed. It was the exact address of the massive luxury estate we were currently sitting inside. He looked at the purchase price. $990,000. He looked at the remaining mortgage balance. It read absolute zero. The property was paid for in cash completely and entirely free and clear of any outstanding debt. He looked up at me, his face a portrait of absolute confusion. He asked me what this meant. He said he did not understand how his name was on the deed to a luxury estate. I leaned back in my chair and looked around the beautiful, echoing dining room. I told him I had purchased this house 3 weeks ago. I explained that I bought it the exact same week Vanessa began planting the fake medical bills and overdue tax notices in my mailbox. I told him I knew her endgame was to liquidate my original home and steal the equity. So I decided to preemptively liquidate a massive portion of my commercial stock portfolio and sink the cash directly into this property. I told him I bought this house specifically for him. Connor stared at the documents, his hands shaking so violently, the heavy paper rattled in the quiet room. He told me he could not accept this. He said he was bankrupt and facing massive fraudulent credit card debts. He stammered that if his name was on this house, Vanessa would immediately unleash her divorce attorneys from her jail cell and claim half the property as a marital asset. He told me she would find a way to drag him into a prolonged legal battle and steal this house from him for just like she had systematically tried to steal everything else he possessed. I offered him a very small, genuine smile. I told him he severely underestimated Winston Pierce. I instructed him to turn to the third page of the document stack. Connor flipped the heavy pages. The third document was a complex, ironclad, irrevocable trust agreement. I explained that Winston had drafted the trust with microscopic precision. The estate was not simply handed to Connor as a traditional gift. It was permanently locked inside a blind, protective trust where Connor was the sole exclusive beneficiary. I told him the legal structure of the trust predated any divorce proceedings and contained strict exclusionary clauses regarding spousal claims. I explained that even the most vicious, bloodthirsty divorce attorney on the planet could never legally touch a single blade of grass on this entire property. The house was completely and permanently shielded from any marital asset division or spousal support litigation. It was an unbreakable legal fortress built exclusively for him, and Vanessa could never lay a single greedy finger on it, even if she spent the rest of her life trying. I pointed to the final page in the stack. I told him to look at the attached financial ledger. Winston had not just secured the house. He had transferred a supplementary fund of $200,000 directly into the trust to cover all property taxes, maintenance, and immediate living expenses for the next decade. I told him the fraudulent credit card debts Vanessa had aggressively opened in his name were already being fiercely contested by Winston and his team of corporate litigators, and those false charges would be entirely wiped from his credit record by the end of the month. Connor stared at the numbers. The realization of what I had done finally washed over him. I had not just exposed his abusive wife. I had completely obliterated the financial ruin she had tried to bury him under. I had restored his life, entirely wiping his slate clean and placing him inside an impenetrable fortress of absolute security. He dropped the heavy legal papers onto the table. He leaned forward and rested his forehead against his folded arms, weeping openly into the quiet room. They were not the painful, agonizing sobs of a broken, defeated man facing the end of his life. They were the deep, profound, cleansing tears of a man who had just been forcefully pulled from the dark, suffocating bottom of a freezing ocean. He cried until his breathing leveled out, and the crushing weight of the past 3 years finally evaporated from his shoulders. I sat beside him in the quiet darkness of the dining room. I did not rush him. I let him release every single ounce of the pain he had carried. I told him he was my only son, and I would gladly burn the entire world to the ground before I ever let anyone manipulate or destroy his future. We sat together in the absolute serene peace of the grand, empty house, knowing the brutal, exhausting war was finally over, and the long process of rebuilding his life could finally begin. 6 months passed, bringing the sharp, crisp chill of late autumn to the estate. The violent, chaotic storm that had ripped through our lives was now nothing more than a distant memory. I sat alone on the sprawling back porch, resting comfortably in a heavy wooden chair. I held a thick ceramic mug of black coffee, letting the rising steam warm my face. I looked out over the perfectly manicured lawns that sloped gently down toward a line of towering ancient oak trees. The morning air was perfectly still. I listened closely to the quiet surrounding me. It was an entirely different kind of quiet now. For the past 3 years, the silence in my life had been a heavy, suffocating blanket. It had been the toxic silence of biting my tongue, of hiding my true strength, of watching my only son slowly drown while a relentless parasite drained his lifeblood. That oppressive, agonizing silence was completely gone. Through the open sliding glass door behind me, I could hear the steady, rhythmic sound of paper shuffling. Connor was sitting inside at the massive mahogany dining table. It was the exact same table where his former life had been brutally and surgically dismantled. Now it served as the solid foundation for his new beginning. I watched him work for a moment. He was no longer the hollowed-out, broken shell of a man who had walked through my front doors half a year ago. He was not hunched over in perpetual exhaustion. His posture was completely different. His spine was straight, and his broad shoulders were squared. The dark, bruised circles under his eyes had faded completely, replaced by a sharp, intense focus. The calluses on his hands remained, but they were no longer the result of mindless, desperate labor to feed a black hole of fabricated debt. He was currently organizing 2 separate, thick stacks of legal documents. The first stack was the finalized paperwork for his annulment. Vanessa had tried to fight it tooth and nail from her cell in the federal penitentiary. Even facing a severe multi-year sentence for felony elder endangerment and wire fraud, she had tried to drag out the divorce proceedings. She threw desperate, pathetic legal maneuvers against the wall, hoping to extract one final payout or a slice of the estate. But Winston Pierce had crushed every single motion with absolute ruthless efficiency. The marriage was entirely voided. The fraudulent debts she had aggressively opened in his name were completely erased from his credit history. The slate was wiped entirely clean. She was locked away in a concrete cell, stripped of her luxury clothes and her artificial charm, left with absolutely nothing but the crushing reality of her own choices. The second stack of papers resting on the mahogany table represented his future. They were the official incorporation documents for his new commercial contracting business. He was building his own empire from the dirt up, just as I had done 40 years ago. But I did not simply hand him the money to start the company. I did not give him a blank check or a limitless safety net. I gave him a secure, strictly regulated commercial loan. We sat down together with Winston in this very room and drafted a rigorous repayment schedule with ironclad terms and fixed interest rates. Connor had explicitly insisted on it. He did not want a handout from his wealthy father. He wanted to earn his success with his own 2 hands and his own sweat. He wanted to feel the true weight of honest labor and the profound pride of actual ownership. He was reviewing his initial equipment purchases and his first quarter profit projections, calculating his margins with the exact same meticulous precision I had taught him when he was a teenager. Our relationship had fundamentally and permanently shifted. The days of unspoken resentments and hidden sacrifices were completely over. We no longer operated in the shadows, trying to protect each other with comfortable omissions or silent endurance. Our bond was now forged in the blinding light of absolute truth. We had established clear, unyielding boundaries. I was his father and his closest mentor, but I was no longer his silent punching bag or his secret savior. I would guide him through the treacherous waters of the commercial construction industry. I would advise him on how to spot corrupt vendors and how to negotiate brutal contracts. But I would never again allow anyone to manipulate my wealth or compromise his future. He knew exactly who I was and the true extent of the empire I had built. The respect between us was now mutual, absolute, and undeniable. Connor gathered the business documents into a neat, tidy stack and slid them into a leather folder. He stood up from the table and stepped out onto the back porch. He did not look like a victim anymore. He looked like a man who had walked through hell and emerged completely forged in fire. He stood beside my chair and looked out over the sprawling green lawn, taking a deep, slow breath of the crisp morning air. He handed me the finalized business plan for my review. I took the heavy folder from his hands. I did not pat him on the back or offer him empty, overly emotional praise. I simply placed the folder on the table next to my coffee and told him we would review the profit margins together immediately after lunch. He nodded, his eyes clear and remarkably sharp. He understood the expectation. He welcomed the high standard. He was finally standing on his own 2 feet, ready to conquer the world on his own terms. He turned around and walked back inside to finish preparing his afternoon meetings, leaving me alone on the quiet porch. I lifted the ceramic mug and took a slow, deliberate sip of the hot, dark coffee. The bitter, robust taste grounded me perfectly in the present moment. I looked out at the towering oak trees standing strong and unyielding against the gentle autumn breeze. The leaves rustled softly, creating a comforting, natural melody that drifted across the pristine property. I closed my eyes and simply existed in the quiet morning light. The brutal, agonizing war was entirely a thing of the past. The predatory infection had been permanently eradicated, and the natural order of my family had been flawlessly restored. The silence of the morning was no longer a symptom of endurance. It was no longer a warning of impending conflict or the heavy, suffocating weight of an unspoken lie. It was the profound, beautiful sound of absolute, untouchable peace. This story reveals that true love within a family requires the establishment of absolute, unyielding boundaries rather than endless, silent sacrifice. A father who simply endures abuse to maintain an illusion of peace only enables the destruction of the people he hopes to protect. When manipulative predators exploit fundamental decency, the only cure is the harsh, undeniable light of truth. Stripping away the toxic elements allows the victim to rebuild their life on a foundation of genuine self-respect and honest labor. Real dignity is never given freely, but earned through confronting reality and taking absolute control of your own destiny. If you found this story compelling and want to hear more tales of ultimate justice, please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment below.